What up, everybody? It's that time for our midweek moment. I want to thank you guys for tuning in, all the good feedback that's encouraging me to keep doing this thing. Again, we're going to do it until y'all stop responding or stop watching it. Anyway, I'm super excited about today and just what God's doing in our lives and in our church. Just an exciting season. I love summer, but I'm also glad whenever things kind of start ramping into the year and kind of get back to a normal schedule and all that kind of stuff. I'm a kind of a rhythm guy, so I need the rhythm in my life. I don't know where you're at and all that, but I need the grind. So anyway, just encouraged with where I'm at. I hope you're encouraged today. I just want to bring a word of encouragement to you. I've just really been thinking a lot about God's greatness and God's grace in my life. And just about the people I know. And, you know, a lot of times we can feel insignificant. We can feel insecure into what we feel like God's put in our heart. I know a lot of times, man, for things that God's called me to, I wrestle a lot of times daily with security and just feeling inadequate and feeling, you know, not really having what maybe you might call the faith really to do what God's called me to do. Sometimes it's the courage is really what I'm asking for, but if we have the faith, then God always gives the courage. So I kind of want to deal with that today about just feelings of inadequate and feelings of being feeling like we're just not good enough or not strong enough or not having a level of faith or the courage that we need to do what God has called us to do. And I've been reading a little bit. We're in this series called Royalty here at Overflow, and I've been thinking a lot about David and Saul, just the first two kings of Israel and how they responded. And if you look at Saul started off really well, but ended pretty bad. And David actually came from obscurity and wasn't perfect, but really kind of worked things out, and he had a heart that longed after God. But one of the things that you notice when you look at the scriptures is that Saul was cut out for the job. He was tall. Scripture actually says, Samuel said this about him, that there was no one like him. But David, he was just a shepherd boy out in a field. And isn't it interesting that David's legacy is so much greater than Saul's was? And, it's interesting that God likes to take what would appear to be insignificant or the unusable, and he likes to use that. And I think a lot of that has to do is whenever we are gifted and we are confident in an area, many times we don't trust the Lord in those things. Many times we just kind of go with what we're strong at. And I would just really discourage you to just doing the things that you're good at. God's given us those things. I think a lot of times that we need to do that, but so many times we end up being dependent upon the areas that we're strong in, and it just doesn't take a lot of faith. And we're called to live by faith and walk by faith. And if we're really going to accomplish greatness in God's sight, then we've got to do the things that He's put in our heart. And it's not necessarily an area that we're gifted in. It's not necessarily an area that we're strong in. And so I just really encourage you to stretch yourself. Don't just live in the convenience and the comfort mentality, but stretch yourself into really what you believe. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you know the things that God has really put in your heart. Sometimes they have to do with our gift mix, but a lot of times it's stuff that we totally feel inadequate about. I was thinking about this morning, that God can work with the weak and willing better than He can work with the strong and capable. And many times when we're strong and capable, we don't depend on the Lord. We don't trust the Lord. But when we're weak, then we kind of depend on the Lord a lot better. But I can tell you today that if you are weak yet willing, that God will make you strong and able. In fact, He will be strong and He will be able on your behalf. So don't depend on your own strength. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 says, "My grace is sufficient." This is Paul talking about, being capable of doing what God's called him to do, being able to endure what God's called him to do. And he's like, Lord, you need to just remove me from the situation. God told him, He said, "My grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness." So what do we do with this thing called weakness? Many of us just ignore it. We don't explore those areas of our life. But I think God in our weakness is inviting us to say, hey, come on, trust me in my grace. And so I have three things for you today. I'm a preacher, just always have three things. The first thing that I want to encourage you, just to inspire you in the thing that you feel like God's calling you to do, is first of all, be objective. Know what your weaknesses are. Know what your strengths are, but also know what your weaknesses are. I've known people before that weren't very good at things. That thought they were really good at things. I think we probably all can attest to that. But they're just not very objective. They may be really weak at that. And not that the Lord can't improve that, but sometimes people have a confidence that they probably shouldn't have. And so the first thing is just be objective. Be realistic about where you are and where you're at. Romans 12:3 talks about not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. So we need to be objective in where we're at. If we're weak in an area, we just need to be real with that. Man, I've been in church a long time, and I've seen people do a lot of silly things out of their spiritual insecurity, try to yell at the devil or, start going off their Bible knowledge and all that stuff. And a lot of times those things are driven by fear. They're not driven by faith. And it's not saying that we shouldn't always speak the word and all that. I believe that we should, because that is the truth. But driven by insecurity. Hey, what up, Johnny Mathis? Thanks, Dad. Appreciate that. Hey, Veto, I can't see your thing there, but I got a question mark. Thank you guys for tuning in. Love you, Johnny. Thank you guys for tuning in. Anyway, back to this. So be objective. Number 2 is believe. So we've got to believe. We've got to be objective. Hey, this is where I'm at. And then we got to believe God. We got to say, God, this is where I'm at. I need your strength. I know I'm weak in this area, but I'll trust you. I'll trust you in my weakness. And the third thing is just be vulnerable and be honest with God. When we felt like God was calling us to come and plant this church, I was really struggling, man. I did not have the faith for it. And I was mowing the grass one day, and many of you have probably heard this story before, but I was mowing the grass one day, and I told the Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And it was just like this story in Matthew chapter 9. There's a man, and he had a son who was having demonic seizures, and the disciples tried to drive the demons out, and they couldn't. So they brought the boy to Jesus, and Jesus asked the guy, he's like, the guy asked Jesus, he's like, will you touch my boy? And Jesus said, Jesus asked him, he said, do you want me to touch him? And he told Jesus, he said, if you can. And Jesus said, what do you mean if I can? Of course I can. And he said, anything is possible if you believe. And the guy said, hey, I believe, but you got to help my unbelief. And I felt like God was speaking that to me in this season of my life, that I was just objective. I was honest with my weakness. And months later, after we had tons of confirmation and God just did a good thing, sold our house in 24 hours, all these type of things, I was thinking about when I told the Lord that months before. I was telling the Lord, man, I'm so sorry for my unbelief in that moment, for that difficulty. And the Lord told me, he said, Josh, at that moment when you were vulnerable, that's when you place your trust in me. You weren't trusting in yourself. You weren't trusting in your own strength. You actually transferred your trust in that moment when you said, help. Are you still there? All right, my thing got messed up for a minute. But anyway, we need to go to God with our unbelief. Don't try to be spiritual with God. If you don't believe, if you're having struggling with your belief, then don't try to be all super spiritual with God. He knows how fearful you are. He knows how weak you are. He knows how frail you are. But it is all an invitation. It's all an invitation for us to go to him with our weakness and say, God, I'm weak. I'm being objective. I'm weak. I'm vulnerable. I'm here, but I believe. I have a little bit of belief, but would you increase my faith? And so we know that we can build our faith. There's a lot of things that we can do to grow our faith. But man, I think one of the most important things that we can do with God is just be vulnerable and tell him, Lord, this is where I'm at. And you know what will happen when you tell the Lord that? When you say, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief? He'll help your unbelief. That's exactly what he'll do. He won't reject you. And I love that story that he still healed the boy's, the man's son. He still healed him, even in the presence of that area of his unbelief. With a little bit of faith that he had, he said, Lord, will you help me? And God did. And so aren't you encouraged today that even when we don't believe, even when our faith isn't at 100%, when it might just be 80, and we're like, Lord, I want to believe, I'm struggling to believe, would you help me? The Lord looks out and goes, yeah, I can work with that. Let me help your unbelief. And so I love the Lord that he's like that he's kind and compassionate and gracious. So go to him today with whatever you're trusting him with, whatever area you're weak. Again, God can work a lot more with a weak heart that is willing than a strong heart that is independent. So just trust the Lord, whatever you're going through, whatever season you're in, whatever you feel like he's called you to do, and go for it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Leave feedback. Love you. Peace.